Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Dr. Mark Thornton about the origins of money, the relationship between governments and money, and fiat currency. Dr. Thornton is Senior Fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute and is the book review editor of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics and has served on the faculty at Auburn. He is the author of The Economics of Prohibition, Tariffs, Blockades, and Inflation, The Economics of the Civil War, The Quotable Mises, and the Bastiat Collection. You can follow his work on Twitter at Dr. Mark Thornton, the Mises Institute's Facebook page, and the Mises Institute's website, Mises.org. That's MISES.org. For more information, see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/money-origins. Dr. Thornton, thank you for joining us today.
Adam and Daniel, it's a pleasure to be back on your show.
All right, well, thank you. So this is obviously a big topic with a lot that can be said about it. So we'll be moving from one aspect of this to another pretty quickly, but let's just go right in here. So why do individuals exchange goods and services with each other, and how did this lead to barter and then later on to money?
It's a great question. It's the fundamental question of economics. People exchange goods with one another or services and goods with one another because they expect to benefit. They have certain things that they can trade. They have their labor time that they can trade, and they're out there looking for things that provide them with greater amounts of utility. Various food items, clothing items, you name it, people are out there trading. And back in primitive times, thousands of years ago, for example, people were basically producing for themselves and only gradually learned of the benefits of trading with one another. And as this trade developed and flourished, it soon became common for certain items in that primitive economy to be used as a medium of exchange. That is, people were willing to trade for that particular good, not because they were going to use it themselves, but because they felt that they could retrade the good with someone else and have even greater benefits. So an early example of this was salt. Salt was something that was very, very important and relatively expensive compared to the way it is today. And so people who found salt or dug salt out of the ground, they could use that salt to trade for goods, and that salt may be retraded with other individuals. And so in that way, as people learned of these practices surrounding highly valuable salt, salt was important because, of course, they didn't have any kind of refrigeration, so it was a way of storing things like meat for longer periods of time. So as people became aware of that, salt became a medium of exchange and ultimately served as a basis for money in the Middle East in particular.
So is the main really quality the storability when it comes to the commodity and what is desirable in the commodity to be used as money?
Well, in terms of the qualities of the good, it has many different aspects or qualities to various goods. The central key thing is its marketability. Are people willing to trade for that particular item? However, there are other qualities of a good that serve to enhance this marketability. So durability is very important. You wouldn't be trading things over time if the product itself was going to diminish or perish in value. So durability is very important. Storability is very important. It's divisibility, so that you can divide up a large amount of salt, for example, into smaller amounts for smaller trades. And so divisibility, durability, transportability. You wouldn't want to have something that was too heavy to move from one place to another. So all of those qualities of a particular good make it more marketable because it's not going to diminish in value. It's easy to move from one place to another. It's easy to divide a large amount into smaller pieces so that you can make trades of a smaller nature. And so, salt was a good form of money. It was homogeneous relatively. It was durable. It was divisible. It didn't perish and so forth. And so salt was a good early form of money. And over time, the competition between these mediums of exchange ultimately led to the development of money in the form of copper, silver, and gold, because those didn't perish. They were homogeneous, relatively speaking. They were easy to store. They were easy to transport. You could make pieces of metal in small pieces and large pieces. And so metal, as we moved into the metal age, became a dominant form of medium of exchange. And ultimately we saw that perfected in the form of coins.
Okay, so how does it work when you have coexisting and competing types of money? Now, in the present world, people may see this in places where there is a lot of international commerce, or maybe in border regions. But just looking on a real basic example with salt and gold, or gold and silver, or gold and copper, things like that, how does it work when you have multiple types of money more or less competing with each other?
Well, as you move through time, through the Metal Ages, what we saw happen was as civilizations came into contact with one another, their monetary systems would have to compete with one another. And so as Europeans spread around the globe, coming into contact with various indigenous groups of people, we found that the European monetary systems outcompeted the local systems, which were based on commodities, food products, and ornaments such as seashells. The monetary systems of Europe tended to dominate all those other systems. And so as we moved past that age of exploration and colonization, we find that the world became fully united on a gold standard, with silver standards being of secondary importance and silver coins being the primary day-to-day medium of exchange for people, and as well as copper coins as well.
So nowadays we hear a lot about the idea of kind of money supply. So what is the appropriate size of the money supply, and why is hoarding not a problem?
Okay, well, very good question. For Austrian economists, the money supply, any given money supply is sufficient to meet the needs of an economy. If we were to lose, say, 20% of the money supply was destroyed by an asteroid or something, what would happen? There would be a change in the value of money, so that any given unit after that destruction would have a greater purchasing power. So the supply of money, unlike Keynesians and mainstream economists who are constantly worried about the money supply and even stating that increases in the supply of money can somehow revive an economy, which it can't, and which is obvious now. Austrians believe that any particular money supply is very sufficient for the needs of the economy, because the value of the monetary unit can change in response to a change in the demand for money or change in the supply of money. And as a matter of fact, economist Ludwig von Mises, and dating all the way back to Richard Cantillon, showed that an increase in the supply of money is actually somewhat harmful to the economy, because it diverts resources away from the production of everyday goods and services into the production of money. So, say for example, there was a revelation that there were enormous amounts of gold to be found in the state of Minnesota, and all of a sudden people started going to Minnesota and opening up gold mines. That would increase the supply of money in our economy, but it would have diverted resources away from the production of goods and services into the production of new gold mines in Minnesota. So it actually has some bit of harm to the economy, and it also changes the distribution of income in the economy. So Austrians, we're satisfied that any supply of money is sufficient. We're not worried about that, and we even point out that it can have some negative temporary side effects if we were to discover a newly abundant source of the monetary commodity. And so within this framework, Austrians aren't worried about hoarding in an economy where everybody in the economy increases their demand for money and they start storing money, which is referred to in a negative sense as called hoarding, putting away money that you typically aren't going to be using on a day-to-day basis. And the Keynesians and the mainstream economists are deadly fearful of such a process and argue vigorously against it. However, they never bother asking the question, which I think is kind of funny, that why are people hoarding? Why have they increased their demand for money? Well, it's typically because people increase their demand for money because they're worried about something in the economy. They might be worried about a stock market crash. They might be worried about a war or some kind of deadly virus, or could be just about anything that makes people fearful about the near-term future and encourages them to store away more money to mitigate the negative consequences of those feared future events. But again, the Austrians aren't worried about it. Even if there wasn't any bad problem out there, when people hoard money or increase their demand for money, what happens is that, again, the value of the monetary unit, the dollar bill, for example, has a greater purchasing power. And so there's a natural equilibrium. If there is hoarding, the value of money goes up, and so that means that people who are spending their money can get more goods and services for every dollar that they have. And so we don't really worry about hoarding. We never see people indefinitely putting off all types of consumption decisions. Yes, it may be the case that I might delay the purchase of a new personal computer for 6 months or 9 months, but it's not like everybody's doing that en masse for an indefinite period of time. That just doesn't happen. And so we're not worried about the process of hoarding, but we are concerned with why people are hoarding. What is the government doing in terms of war and foreign policy? What is the government doing in terms of money and banking and inflation? Those are the real problems that Austrians see that we really do need to address.
Okay, now something that played a big role in I guess sort of letting the genie out of the bottle as far as expanding the money supply was the establishment of banks. So what brought about the establishment of banks, and then how did that eventually lead to paper money and fractional reserve banking and inflation?
Well, once we got to the point where people were making coins so that they were of a certain weight and size and a certain purity, and they would be marked by the mint as being a certain weight, we then saw a process whereby people were trying to save these coins to build up for future purchases. And as part of that whole process, banks came into being where they would safely store coins for their owners. And so individuals would deposit money with these bankers. The bankers would issue receipts for the number of coins that you deposited, and to be put away for safekeeping. And the early bankers turned out to be goldsmiths and silversmiths, people who already had a inventory on hand for producing various gold and silver items, jewelry and ornaments, etc. And they also had places for safekeeping, where they could lock away the coins of all of their customers, safe from theft and safe from fire and other hazards. And so in this way, the early bankers tended to be goldsmiths and silversmiths who had the necessary tools already at their disposal, and they would store this money for their customers for a small fee of the money that was involved. And so that's how banking initially began and how it got started. There were also intermediaries who early on would make change for all the various competing coined monies, so that there would be a coin that dominated in Bavaria, a coin that dominated in northern Italy, a coin that dominated in eastern France, and so on. And at the edges of these competitions, money changers came into being as an intermediary where people could change their money from one area to another as they moved from one region to another. And so all sorts of new services developed in the free market economy, revolving around the use of money, and bankers were a prominent part of that, as well as money changers.
How does the size and number of individual banks have an effect on the quality and value of money?
Now, what was that, Daniel?
How does the size of individual banks and the quantity of banks affect the quality of money?
Well,
does it matter how big the banks are?
Well, the early banks tend to be relatively small operations, and as they got bigger and more formidable, the number of bankers relative to the population was actually smaller, because people started specializing in banking, so that as they developed out of goldsmiths and silversmiths as a small operation, banks became specialized firms dedicated solely to the production of safety deposit of your coins. And then, of course, out of that grew into the process of lending and issuing paper money, bank notes, and so forth. So this all became a much more complex, but yet very important business, because once you get to the point where banks are able to make loans, well, then they're in the business of financing capitalism. And so the specialization of banks, the larger banks with the capacity to make larger loans, facilitated the formation and development of capitalism, because now companies didn't have to work on their own capital. They didn't have to rely on the small bankers who couldn't make large loans and couldn't make long-term loans. Their type of lending was typically seasonal with agricultural output. And so these larger, more sophisticated banks became able to offer larger and longer-term loans. And this was important for the development of the rest of capitalism and, in particular, industry.
Okay, so now let's move into where government enters the picture. So why have governments interfered with money, and how does that interference with the money supply help governments raise revenue and serve other purposes for governments?
Well, government became involved in this money and banking sector early on. One of the first things they did was to grant themselves a monopoly over the issuing of coins. And so they would typically take over the production of coins, set up a mint to produce the coins, and then declare themselves a monopolist over their territory, so that everybody had to use their particular coins. And so they basically eliminated competition amongst coins and gave themselves a monopoly. And of course, not only was there less competition, but this also opened up the opportunity for government banks and mints to manipulate money. And so we enter a period of a long history where government was causing inflation by issuing a larger number of small coins or a larger number of coins with less silver and gold content. So given that they had a monopoly, what they would do is that the early coins were far less perfect in production than modern coins, and they didn't last as long because the metal was very soft. And so periodically coins had to be taken in and reminted. And it was through this process where coins were taken in via taxes and then reminted to restore their, so you could tell what it was and it wasn't all worn down. This gave governments the opportunity to make the coins less pure or to make the coins lighter weight and therefore cause inflation by increasing the number of coins in an economy and simultaneously, of course, giving government a sort of secret form of revenue. And so it's all fairly natural to believe that a state or a government or a king would like to have that monopoly and would like to exploit that monopoly as a very dependable source of revenues where taxes are not directly involved, but it's done in sort of a secret fashion.
I want to ask about how the current system works right now and what would be the benefits of going back to a commodities-based system instead of a fiat-based system?
Well, yes, we've come full circle with fiat money. In the U.S., the government had the right to determine what our money was with the Constitution, and it had always been a certain content of pure silver would represent the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. dollar was based on a European coin called the thaler, and that thaler, in terms of pronunciation, became the dollar, and it was also very similar to the Spanish peso. And we were on commodity money in the U.S. For a very long time. We became the world's largest economy and most powerful nation on the backs of the gold standard. That gold standard started to diminish about 100 years ago with the founding of the Federal Reserve, Franklin Delano Roosevelt outlawing gold in 1935, and then Richard Nixon taking us off the gold standard, ending the Bretton Woods system in 1971. Of course, we still had silver coins in the U.S. up until 1964, but nowadays our money doesn't represent any connection to a commodity or a real tangible value. It's basically paper money that they can print up. The coins have no metal content worth to speak of anymore. So we're on a pure fiat system where the amount of money and its value is essentially determined by some bureaucrats at the Federal Reserve who make decisions regarding our interest rates, our money supply, the availability of credit, and so on. And of course, that's controlled both by the U.S. government and by the large banks. And so it's not surprised that once you take away the tangibleness of a money and banking system and you replace it with a government/banking system approach, well, they can do anything they want. They could, print up $1 billion bills. They can, buy $1 trillion of government bonds just with a few keystrokes, which they've done. And so there's no connecting our money and banking system to the real economy anymore. It's up to the whims of politicians and bankers. And so we've come a long ways. And I think the world is very nervous about that because of that lack of foundation. And money is very, very important. And that has a lot of people very, very worried about what the Federal Reserve is going to do next, what monetary policies will ensue. We've already had a major bailout of the big banks. The balance sheets of the big banks, their excess reserves, which were typically less than $1 billion before the crisis, are now several $1 trillion. We have a Federal Reserve which has taken over the mortgage market and is monetizing the national debt as we speak, and is now discussing the introduction of negative interest rates. So the system has come completely off-hinged, and so we need to get back to a gold standard to reset that foundation.
All right, so one final question before we start wrapping up, but I want to circle back around to this for the sake of completeness. Can you talk about Greshams Law and how that helps explain fiat money driving out and replacing gold and silver and other commodity-based monies?
Sure. Greshams Law is one of the oldest dictums in economics, and it's typically stated that Greshams Law is that bad money drives out good money. So if there's a competition between a good money and a bad money, what you'll find is that the bad money ends up in circulation and all the good money is taken out of circulation. And we've seen this for over the last 500 years. When government introduces an inferior form of money, it ends up in circulation, and all the good money comes out of circulation and goes into storage because it's worth more on a trading basis than the inferior form. So in 1964, when the U.S. Stopped minting silver coins and started minting clad coins made out of inexpensive metals, well, all of those inexpensive coins, they ended up in circulation, and all the good money went out of circulation and went into hoarding. So it was a direct result of the government introducing an inferior form of money, and this has happened throughout history, and we've gotten an inferior form of money compared to the days of the gold standard or where we had actual silver coins. And basically, today you can see if you had like 4 silver quarters, you could trade them with somebody for a dollar bill, but you could also sell them for over $15. So that gives you some idea of how much inflation we've had since 1964. Basically, a dollar back then is worth more than $15 today. And all of those silver coins have been eliminated from circulation. Every once in a while, you'll find, one in circulation. I remember when silver prices in April of 2011, they were very high. I went to Subway and ordered a sub and a Coke and some chips. And I gave the $10 bill and got change. And in my change was a silver quarter, which at that time was worth more than the cost of my meal. And so that was a lucky day. That was on St. Patrick's Day, believe it or not.
Oh, wow.
And that's what I'm wishing for this St. Patrick's Day, is for everybody to get back on a gold and silver standard monetary system.
That's a great wish.
Excellent. I want to ask real quick, going back to getting on a gold standard, how would the value of certain commodities and their fluctuations affect gold standard system or commodity basket standard system. We've seen copper and oil, especially in the last 6 months, drastically drop in value. How would that affect the commodity-backed currency?
Well, we don't have to worry about volatility so much on a gold and silver standard. What's causing the wide gyrations in the price of gold, the price of oil, the price of copper today and over the last few years is the fiat monetary system, which is fluctuating wildly and causing booms and busts in various commodity markets. If we go back to a gold standard, what you'll see, and you can go back and look at historical statistics, everything is very, very stable until 1971, and then everything goes crazy in terms of the trade deficit, the national debt. All the historical series go very smoothly over time, and then after 71, everything goes crazy. And so when we get back onto a gold standard, of course, depending on how they set it up, the prices of things will be low and tending lower over time, and they'll be very stable. So that prior to going off the gold standard, a barrel of oil was a relatively constant price through time, and so that we would expect much more stability in the economy in terms of commodity prices and in terms of the business cycle. That's one of the great things about the gold standard, is that there are certain things like short-term interest rates, which might be a little more variable as it serves as a shock absorber throughout the economy. But basically what we would expect is that the purchasing power of our money would be relatively constant, and it would tend actually to increase. So the historical experience has been that our gold and silver money appreciates in purchasing power on average about 2% a year. So that means that if we saved, say, 12 to 15% of our incomes every week, and we put that in the bank and earned a normal rate of interest like 3 or 4% instead of the 0.01% that I'm currently earning on my savings account. If we saved our income, we put it in the bank, we got interest, and our money appreciated in purchasing power, it would be very easy for Americans not to be living paycheck to paycheck the way they currently are. We would be encouraged to save, we would earn interest, and our money would become more valuable over time. That's another great thing about the gold standard.
All right, well, we'll leave it there for today. But before you go, how can people follow your work? And if our listeners are interested in learning more about this and related topics, what do you recommend they read?
Well, of course, I would recommend you go to mises.org. We have a very prolific, interesting blog where great and young scholars are contributing to every day. A lot of exciting stuff there. We have a very active Facebook page. We'd like you to go and like us on our Facebook page. Follow @Mises on Twitter or @Dr. Mark Thornton on Twitter. And of course, we have a fabulous bookstore with everything in Austrian economics, everything from Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt to all the works of Mises, all the works of Murray Rothbard, Ron Paul. It's all there, and it's at a very low cost because the books are subsidized, and so it's very easy to accumulate an entire library of physical or electronic books by going to Mises.org, and I would encourage you to do so. We also have conferences at the Institute and around the country. We have one coming up in Fort Worth, Texas. Very exciting stuff. Austrian economics has become a very dynamic, exciting space on the internet and in higher education. So I'd encourage everybody to, really explore, become enlightened, and have fun doing it.
Well, excellent. I just want to remind our listeners to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/money-origins. We'll have links to all of the things you discussed there, and we'll link to a talk you gave at Auburn, on the subject of what is money. We'll also link to Rothbard and what has government done to our money. That seems to be a really important work for this subject. And we'll be exploring some of these topics in future episodes, but I really just wanted to get a foundation laid, lay the groundwork for this topic since it's so important and so fundamental. So thank you for helping us do that today, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Daniel. It's been a pleasure.
All right, take care.
You too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.